Welcome to a history lesson with me. I've set this up just in case something goes wrong tomorrow with the call, which is possible because the internet calling system hasn't been going fantastically. So, as a backup, here's the PowerPoint. Here's me. Hopefully you can hear me, and I'll bung this video up on the Microsoft Teams site. Watch it. If you've got any questions, please let me know. And for future lessons, I'm going to try and live stream them probably on YouTube. There is a way of doing it through Teams, but the school doesn't really have it, so it'll probably be on YouTube, which means you'll be able to drop a like, smash that subscribe button, and cop the merch. So, Wall Street crash is what we're looking at. We've looked so far at the whole of the 1920s, going back from the beginnings at the end of the First World War, looking at various slices of cultural life in the USA, looking at the role of women, looking at some forms of prejudice, including the lives of black people, lives of Native Americans. We saw the economic boom to begin with, and what we'll see now is the economic bust. How do you go from the USA being this huge booming economy at the beginning of the 1920s to in 1929 you've got one of the biggest global crises in the economy that the world has ever seen? So that's what we'll look at today. You can see my email address there, WMRF. I think I'd rather if you get in touch with me, do so via Teams, because it just keeps everything easy and I can chat with you on there much more easily than I can over email. Okay. With regards to where the PowerPoint is, it's in the OneNote. Ina, up in the chat a little bit higher up on the page, left some instructions there. Basically, all you need to do, if you're on mobile, then up on the top of the page it should say something like posts and then more. And if you click on more, then you can get to the class OneNote there. If you're on desktop, which I really heavily recommend, use the desktop version. It's better than the app, much better than the app. But on the desktop version, it's just up there. It says class notebook. So you go there and you go to the library section. Can't remember exactly what it was. Begins with a C, something library. And then in there you'll see Roaring Twenties. And inside there will be this PowerPoint under the Wall Street crash document. If you need any help with that, please do let me know. The whole point behind this in such tricky times and tricky circumstances, just to make it as easy as possible. So if it's not easy, then you need help, then let me know. Simple. Okay, Wall Street crash. Let's have a look. So, economy in the 1920s is what we did way back at the beginning of term. We've got this little cartoon here of that's President Calvin Coolidge taking the heartbeat of American business, and you can see the caption. Corny stuff, but what it summarizes is what the economy was like in the 1920s. And as we saw at the beginning of the year, there was this massive boom in the economy, huge post-war boom. Why? Well, because the United States had done not terribly out of the First World War. Remember, there wasn't any fighting in the United States, and the USA only joined in April of 1917, which meant that all these other countries in Europe had been more or less destroyed by it. I mean, Germany has a revolution, Britain barely survives by the skin of her teeth, Russia has a massive revolution, France also barely survives by the skin of their teeth. USA, however, they're doing okay. And they can use the fact they're doing okay, use the fact that other countries are rebuilding to focus on their economy and to build up their economy. So that's what they do. Couple of policies behind that make a difference for the USA. First one is isolationism, which we saw at the beginning of term. Isolationism, if it's got ism on the end, then generally that means it's an ideology, a system of beliefs. And in this case, isolationism, ism, ideology, isolation, being apart. So isolationism is the ideology of one country being as far apart from the others as they can, especially in terms of the economy. So what that means in this context is that the USA didn't like to get stuck in helping other countries anywhere near as much as they do throughout the rest of the 20th and 21st centuries. So they're an isolationist country. They got loads of new technology. Remember things like tumble dryers, washing machine, cars, the production line, radios, etc., etc., etc. They've got laissez-faire policies, which I think is one of the questions for your prep. Laissez-faire in French, of course, means to leave alone, to let be. And so laissez-faire policies is that the government just let the economy do what the economy is going to do. They don't get in with harsh tariffs. They don't get in by trying to fund things. They just let the economy do what the economy is going to do. The tariffs that they do have aren't internal, they're on imports. So I explained this at the beginning of the year. Let's say I've got two pencils. This pencil here comes from the United States. This pencil here comes from the United Kingdom. The US pencil won't have the same amount of tax on it as the UK pencil will. And so that means this pencil is going to cost more. So why spend the extra money for what is ultimately just a pencil? So that's how tariffs work. By making pencils broken. Wouldn't want to spend more on it anyway. By making foreign produced products more expensive, it means that people are going to turn to locally produced products, and that's how you fund your local economy. So it's not very good for foreign relations, but of course in the 1920s every other country is pretty much destroyed after the First World War, so the USA can just throw their weight around as much as they want, and so that's why they put tariffs on their imports. Added into that, with the post-war boom, a lot of it's based on something called shares, which is in the news quite a lot at the moment because of things like share buybacks and companies wanting bailouts. What a share is kind of a bet. It's that a company will sell you a certain amount of their company, say 1%, 2%, 0.5%, that kind of thing, and you buy it in order to fund the company. If the company does well, someone else will want to buy that share for more money because they think, someone else after that's going to want to buy the share for even more money. So a share is just a little slice of a company that you buy, either to support it or more likely, and especially in the 1920s, because you think it's going to get more valuable. And so if you buy something really cheap and it takes off, then you can make a lot of money for doing very, very little. It's like if you bought shares in Apple, say in 1980, when it was just Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in their garage, putting together the very first Apple devices. If you bought shares back then, or when they first became available, and you sold them now, then the amount of money you would have made off that would be easily enough to live on for the rest of your life. It's a way of funding the economy. It is kind of gambling, and it's how a lot of people make a lot of money. So all of those policies in together mean that the United States is booming. And as I was just explaining, a lot of it is based on shares. So here it is in a bit more detail. You buy a share of a company to support it, or because you think that share is going to get more and more expensive, and so it's a good investment. And because lots of people are getting involved in buying these shares, this means that the price of their shares goes up. And this all turns into something called speculation. This is kind of the gambling aspect of what I was just explaining. To speculate on something is to guess, essentially. So I would speculate that, I'm probably not going to do much over these coming holidays because it's an educated guess. I can't go out the house very much, certainly can't at the moment because I'm still in isolation, and over the next 3 weeks that's probably not going to change. So I speculate I'm not going to do much over the holidays. These people in the 1920s were speculating on the price of their shares. Is it going to go up? And the way it works is that because you're not buying a stake of a company to support it, you just want to buy a share of a company, wait until it goes up a tiny, tiny bit, and then sell it. And if you do that once, then you'll just make a tiny, tiny bit of money. But if you do it over and over and over and over again, then you'll make lots and lots of tiny bits of money. And that all adds up to a huge amount of money. This is why, say, in Europe, the financial centre of Europe, which is London but is now moving to Frankfurt, the companies that run the stock markets spend a huge amount of money getting the finest internet connection they can between Frankfurt and New York, or London and New York, because every single millisecond that's lost in between a signal going from Frankfurt to New York is a millisecond in which you could have bought and sold another share and therefore made a tiny, tiny fraction of money. And so the more you can sell, the quicker you can sell them, then the more money you can make. And so that means that people in the 1920s, the stock market becomes this huge deal for everyone. Everyone in the country is getting involved in it because it's easy. You just buy and sell really quickly. Or, in fact, what you'd normally do is you hire someone to buy and sell for you. And so people would head down to the stock market, they'd essentially gamble on which stock they think would do well over the next 10 minutes, buy it, sell it, and then move on. And go to the next one, go to the next one, go to the next one. It wouldn't even be 10 minutes, it'd be seconds sometimes. And today, as I was just saying, it's milliseconds. It's fractions of a second that you buy a stock and then sell it. Because remember, you don't need to make money off that one thing. If you're doing it over and 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 over, then you can make money off thousands of stocks a minute. So, because it's becoming this big deal, people are taking out loans to then get involved with shares and speculation. So that means that people are essentially betting money that they don't really own. A loan isn't money that you own yourself. It's money that someone's given to you that you're going to guarantee giving back to them later with a bit more money on top. So that means people are buying money to spend to make money. All of it's based on guesswork and future and hope, essentially. And the big problem with it is that if I've got confidence that you're going to go and speculate this money well and make money off it, I'll give you money. Sure, whatever. You want 100 quid to go and make money off, I don't know, buying and selling stocks for a little bit? Sure, why not? Because you're going to make money. But if I think you want 100 quid, but I'm not sure that stock prices are going to keep going up, then that element of doubt means that I'm probably not going to give you the money. And if I don't give you the money, then that means that the stock price won't go up. And if the stock price doesn't go up, then there's only one other direction it can go. So, shares and speculation, I'm just going to nip back to that previous slide briefly. Shares and speculation are a huge part of the economy in the 1920s, as they are today. People are making money off it in a way that they hadn't been previously. And whereas it started off to fund companies, that's the original point of it. It was especially in insurance companies back in the 17th century. And this is where newspapers come out, actually. People would fund a ship that was, say, sailing off to Indonesia to go and pick up spices. They would buy a share in the ship and in the company that was doing the ship, that was sailing the ship. And when it comes back, they can then get a share of the profit. So that's the idea. You're helping to fund something in order to get a share of it back later. That's the basic idea. Newspapers, by the way, where they come from, in order to understand which ships were going where and what was going well and which ships should be insured, then people started writing newspapers in coffee houses, particularly a coffee house called Lloyd's, which turned into the bank and the insurance company of Lloyd's of London. Anyway, shares and speculation starts off as this way of funding companies, and it grows and it grows and it grows and it grows until in the 1920s in particular, it's a way to make money. And that's very much what we see today. It's a way to make money, although perhaps less so today. But a couple of months ago, it was a way to make money. And in the 1920s, it's similar. It's a way that you can take money that you've got, sell a share, buy a share, sell more shares, buy more shares, etc., etc. It's like a marketplace, except the product is money. So, apart from that, there are other problems going on in the 1920s. It's not just that everything's based on buying and selling shares, which, as we'll see, is pretty unstable. First of all, construction's beginning to slow down. This is another one of the questions that you had in the prep. Why would that have a knock-on effect? Construction's been booming in the beginning of the 1920s, but there's only so many buildings you can build, and construction's also based on confidence. If you don't think you can sell a house, then you're not going to build a house. And especially when you get massive projects, an individual can't build a building, can't afford to build a building as enormous as, say, the Empire State Building, or the Woolworth Building, which is from a little bit before, but a company can. but a company won't then move into it. A company will build that building and then sell it to someone else, or sell it in part to other people. But if no one's buying, then you're not making. So as demand begins to decrease, then construction begins to slow down quite a lot. Added into that, the foundation of the American economy, still in the 1920s, is very much based on raw material production. Less so today, but you've still got some raw material production, especially oil in places like Texas or Alaska. But the four main products you can see there: coal, oil, iron, and coke. Oil is just crude oil, which you refine into plastics or into what the Americans call gas, petrol. Iron, you add... Well, iron and coke kind of go together because you take iron and you add coke to it, which is like a carbon thing. It's got nothing to do with Coca-Cola. It's a form of carbon pretty much. And you take iron and coke, smush them together in hot temperatures, and it creates steel, which is much, much stronger than iron. Iron you can bend quite easily, whereas steel, because it's got these little blobs of carbon in there, you can't bend it anywhere near as easily. So coal, oil, iron, coke, all of those slowing down. Construction also slowing down. And that means that the economy is beginning to slow down as a whole, including what America sells. If America is not making stuff with its raw materials, then America is not selling stuff. Added into that, by the end of the 1920s, quite a lot of these other countries around the world are doing quite well. Britain's more or less back on its feet. Germany's getting there. Although, of course, late 1920s through to the 1930s in Germany are not an especially happy time. But the Americans have been funding projects like the Dawes Plan, like the Young Plan that you'll see next year, that have helped the Germans out in particular. And so that means that there are fewer markets abroad. So the Americans are losing their export markets, partly because they're doing successfully the export markets, but also partly because the American economy is slowing down. So all of that means that in 1929, everything gets a bit crashy. It kind of all starts with confidence. If you have confidence, imagine, going to a casino. If you have confidence when you go to a casino, you're just going to splash the cash around and you might win something. If you don't have any confidence, then you won't, and you're not going to win anything. Stock market's like that, except you're more guaranteed to win if you know what you're doing, much less rigged in favour of the house. And so if you buy a share and you think it's going to sell for more, then you'll go ahead and buy more shares. If you're worried that your share price isn't going to keep going up, then you're not going to buy a share, because why would you? It doesn't make any sense. If you think there's a possibility that I'm going to buy this share for, say, £1 and I'm going to sell it for 80p, then you've lost 20p. So you're better off just sticking with the pound in the first place. So if you think, I buy something for £1, I sell it for £1.20, and that's going to keep on happening over and over again, brilliant. Keep on buying. You're making money. If you think, hang on a minute, it looks as though something's slowing down, then you're not going to buy. Why would you? Just throwing your money away. And if you're not buying, then you're selling. But the problem is, if I'm selling a share and you're selling a share, we're both selling to, say, a third party. Say, is my cat here? Yeah, my cat's over there on the window. I'll go grab her. Come on, kitten. You're needed for educational purposes. So, here's my cat. She's called Frida. She's lovely. Hello. So, I'm selling a share, and Frida's selling a share. I'm selling my share for £1. What does Frida go along and do? She sells it for 90p. So I'll sell it for 85p, so she'll sell it for 80p. And you can see the problem here. The more shares that are on the market, the lower the price has to be. And the lower the price has to be, the more shares you want to sell. Because I'd rather, if I'm going to make a loss, I'd rather sell a share for 60p than for 55p, because it's less of a loss. So as soon as the market starts to tilt away from being, I'm covered in cat hair now, starts to tilt away from being about buying and towards selling, then panic begins to set in. And I mean, you've seen what people are like when they start to panic with supermarkets recently. Panic is a weird kind of mental virus that as soon as it sets in, it grips people. and it won't let them go. And that's exactly what happened in the Wall Street crash. One person starts selling, 10 people start selling, the whole country starts selling. And that means that the price just goes down and down and down. And you end up with this huge crash. Because I've got to get rid of these stocks somehow. Because pretty soon, everyone else would have sold theirs and these will be worthless. But the problem is that mentality means that the stocks already are worthless in a way. So that's how you end up with such a big crash. And here you can see I've got this little diagram, little circle diagram. It starts off with confidence. That's pretty much the first step. People think oil's going down, coal's going down, coke's going down, iron's going down, construction's going down, exports are going down, the economy's going down. Time to start selling. And so because confidence begins to go, then people think, I got to sell my stock now, because if I wait 20 minutes, it's going to be worth less and I've lost out. If I wait a week, then it'll be worthless and I'll be destitute, I'll be bankrupt. So confidence goes, people think that they need to sell their stocks, which means that the price comes down, which means that people think, oh my God, the price is coming down, I need to sell my stock now. And then that means that they sell their stock and the price comes down, and they sell their stock and the price comes down. And it's a vicious circle that ends up in what I think I had on the last slide. Yeah, there, the race to the bottom. It is a race to the bottom in terms of prices, that you've got to get rid of your stock now, because in 2 minutes it's going to be worth nothing. So it's a race. But of course it's a race that's only going in one direction. So the timeline specifically here, hopefully it's all fairly self-explanatory. People start noticing the signs of the economy slowing down quite a lot in June, but the prices keep on going up from June through July and August all the way to the beginning of September. The fact it's the hottest day is irrelevant but interesting. 3rd of September is the last day that prices go up. And then they begin to start coming down. On the 5th of September, Babson the Boffin spots this and thinks, this is bad because there isn't much going on that can bolster the economy. But still from there, it takes a good 6 or 7 weeks for it to begin to really kick in. On the 21st of October is when people really are starting to get a move on and thinking, I need to sell these stocks now because this time next week they might not be worth anywhere near as much. And of course, hindsight proves them to have been correct. The point about the ticker there, what the ticker is back then people didn't have instant information. They would get literally ticker tape, which, like when you watch live news, there's that little bar along the bottom which has kind of breaking news, blah, blah, blah. That's called a ticker because it ticks over the information that's coming in. And in the 1920s, and actually all the way up until telephones became really prevalent, and then the internet later after that, people would use ticker tape, which is just a little machine that spits out a roll of tape, and printed on the tape is share prices. So this is why you might see it. You'll see it definitely on business websites or business news programs. The ticker at the bottom will be share prices, and it'll be the stock, which is normally a 4-letter acronym. So like APPL, I think, is Apple, or that kind of thing. And it'll be up, and then by however much, and then a percent, or it'll be down and by however much and by a percent. So that's just the way that people got their information as to what the stock price actually was. And on the 21st of October, people were selling their stocks so much that from the minute it took me to sell my stock to the minute that the price I sold it out was reported is a gap of 90 minutes. Bearing in mind, people are buying and selling these at a rate of seconds. For it to be 90 minutes behind is a huge catastrophe, because people just don't know what price things are being sold at. And so you would sell something at a low price when actually somebody's just sold it at a much higher price, or vice versa. And either way, someone's getting screwed over. And if someone's getting screwed over at such a quick rate, then panic sets in massively. And from the 21st of October, you can see that viral panic, that idea of it spreads throughout the whole population, and everybody's terrified that they're going to be ruined by this crash. So 21st of October is a real turning point, and the 24th of October, this is where you see a bit of intervention. Companies trying to help out. Government isn't going to help out because they got their laissez-faire policies. The idea that we just let the economy sort itself out is what Adam Smith, the economic thinker, called the invisible hand of the market. Just there's a force within capitalism. There's a force within capitalism that will guide the way the markets work. And so everything will turn out okay because of this benevolent, or at least beneficent force. Benevolent means it wants good, like it's Latin, bene volo, I think, is I want good, whereas beneficent, benefacio, to do good. So that's the idea, that it's a beneficent force that will sort the economy out. But as you can see, on the the 24th, banks begin to buy stocks because they've got money that they can use to buy stocks. By the 28th, banks realise they don't have enough money to support this. And that's kind of the point of a bank, is to have money, and that's how severe the crisis is getting. They are running out of money at a rate of knots. So the 28th is a huge fall. On the 29th, this is the day of the Wall Street crash. Is the 29th of October 1929, pretty much, because this is the day when people realise it's all over, it's done. And you might have kind of heard stories or even seen pictures of bankers hurling themselves out the window because they're done. They've got nothing, and there's no way back. And the big problem is the loans and the savings. The loans is what I was talking about before. People were buying stocks based on loans. The idea there is that the bank will give you money because they think the stock price is going to go up, so I'm going to get this money back. It's why banks won't just loan anybody money. You've got to apply for a loan, and the bank will say, is there a chance that you're not going to be able to pay me back? In the 1920s, they just chuck your money out left, right and centre. Everything's going well, so you'll definitely be able to pay me back. But all of a sudden, nobody's got any money because the stock prices have collapsed so much that people are selling them for nothing. So that means there's all of a sudden the banks aren't getting their loans back. And if the banks aren't getting their loans back, then all of the money they thought they have, indeed all the money they were counting on having, is gone. Never really existed. But now it's definitely gone, because there's no way people are paying that money back. So loans are a big problem. Savings are the big problem that come out of that, because if the bank's been loaning people money out and all of a sudden all this money that they've been counting on has disappeared, then they've got no money. And so somebody's going to go to the bank and say, can I get my money out? And the bank will have to say to them, I'm very sorry about this, but we don't have any money. Even though it says on your bank statement you've got, I don't know however much it is, $15,000 in savings that you saved up over your life, we spent it on loans and the loans aren't coming back, so you got no money. That's kind of how a bank works. The reason why banks give you a little bit of money in the form of interest for keeping your savings with them is because they'll go and loan it out to other people and make money off it. That's what a bank does. It makes money off money. And so there is always the possibility that when you give a bank your money, they can turn around and say, terribly sorry about this, but we don't have your money. And that's tough. That's what a bank contract's for. Unfortunately, the alternative is keep it in your mattress, which doesn't really work because, it'll get gross. So you can't do anything other than keep your money in a bank, but it is entirely possible that one day the bank will turn around and say, we don't have it. We spent it and it's not coming back. Whoops. And that's what happens in 1929. The banks spend the money on loans and it disappears because of this crash, and the people are left without savings. So that's how we get to the Wall Street crash, and that's how people end up so destitute. In terms of short-term impacts, aside from that, in the very, very short term, it's generally the rich who are the most heavily invested, and so it's generally the rich who lose out the most. If you've been borrowing, as I was just explaining, then you don't have the money. You've got to somehow find the money to get the loans. If you can't, then you go bankrupt. Bankrupt is where you say to a bank, I don't have any money left, so there's nothing for you to claim. It's you've got to then detail everything that you've got, essentially, and the bank can come and take stuff off you in order to make sure you really genuinely don't have any money left. But that's the idea, that a bankrupt, you've rupt like rupture, bank, you've broken the bank, you don't have any money left to give to the bank. And so that means that the banks are in serious trouble because they don't have any money. And a bank without money is just a building. And the whole point of a bank is to look after money, and now they don't have any money. People at this point in time, they're kind of thinking this is all going to blow over fairly soon. It's the 1920s, everything's going well. They didn't realise what was around the corner. What was around the corner was the Great Depression, which I'm sure you've heard of. It's, in terms of the American psyche, one of the most traumatic events that has ever happened in American culture, probably up there with Vietnam and the Civil War. We came across the Civil War, of course, with the Ku Klux Klan. Vietnam you'll come across when you do GCSE history. But in between, you have the Great Depression. You may well have read some books set in and around the Great Depression. John Steinbeck, of course, of Mice and Men is from the Great Depression, or East of Eden. It's a huge part of American culture, and the reason why is because it's devastating. Reason number one, banks stay bankrupt. Banks don't get the money back because all this money that people have been loaning out has just disappeared. So the banks, they got nothing. Banks collapse. And because the banks have collapsed, people don't have any money, and because people don't have any money, they stop buying things. And capitalism works off buying things, pretty much. You can't have a system based off buying and selling goods if nobody's buying anything. And so once people stop buying things, then the economy's just dead. And because people aren't buying things, then you can see it today. I don't want to get too doom and gloom about things today, because obviously the world's in a pretty rough situation. But you can see this kind of thing at the moment. If people are quarantined at home, then they can't really go out and buy stuff. They can buy stuff online, so it's not too bad, but they can't go and buy stuff from the local shops. And so if they can't go and buy stuff, then the people who work in that shops their employers can't afford to employ them anymore, because there's no money coming in. So that means that huge numbers of people get laid off. People stop buying things, so companies don't have any money coming in, so workers begin to get laid off. And so unemployment is a huge problem in the 1920s. Millions of people who had great jobs in the 1920s, as we get into the 1930s, I think I just said huge problem in the 1920s, big problem in the 1930s. As we get into the 1930s, you've got millions of people who they don't have any money because they don't have a job, which means they don't have food, they don't have shelter. This is something that America will deal with in a way through a president called Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who creates something called the New Deal. New Deal, not New Deal. You might have heard something in the news about the Green New Deal in the United States. This is an ecological version of that, an environmentalist version of that, which is basically state expenditure. The government will fund projects which will give people money which they can then spend. And a lot of the highways, a lot of the railways, a lot of the sewers and infrastructure, bridges, that kind of thing in the United States were built in the 1930s. In Germany, if you want to see what happens in Germany as a result of the Great Depression, at least in part, then stick around for GCSE history. There's a big problem that is kind of related to all of this, but not as closely. But in terms of the American psyche, these two things are completely co-joined. Into American culture is what I mean by the psyche. Psyche is the mind, so the American cultural makeup of their mind. The Dust Bowl and the Great Depression go hand in hand. What the Dust Bowl is parts of the country had been completely over-farmed. Places like Oklahoma, Nebraska in particular. Very, very flat states, very, very good for farming. Nebraska's famous for its corn. Their American football team at the University of Nebraska is called the Cornhuskers, for example. Weird mascot, but it's because they do corn in Nebraska. Very, very flat, very wide states. Iowa's like this as well. By the late 1920s, they've been so over-farmed that there just wasn't any nutrients left in the soil. And so that means there's nothing holding the soil together. So as a plant grows, it takes food out of the soil. It takes energy from the sun, water, carbon dioxide, and it takes nutrients out of the soil. But that means if you don't replenish those nutrients using fertilizer or by letting the soil rest for a year, then you're just eating them up and you're not replacing them. They're not renewable, and so they can't replenish. And so that means after a period of time, after long enough of doing this over and over again, that the soil just turns into dust. There's nothing left in the soil holding it together. It just turns into dust. And that means, as you can see in the photo on this slide, that when the wind comes along, it'll just whip up huge dust storms that will envelop an entire town and march across the whole of states and wipe out houses and destroy them. And because there's nothing stopping them, because there's no trees or mountains or anything in these very, very wide states like Kansas, which is of course, Wizard of Oz is set in Kansas, or Oklahoma, or Nebraska, or Iowa, etc., etc. Then you get tornadoes, like in the Wizard of Oz. You get twisters, very, very destructive wind patterns that will just rip a town apart. Especially when, as you can see on this picture, the houses aren't very sturdy. They're made out of wood. And they generally single story. So huge dust bowl created throughout the whole of the kind of south Midwest of the country, because all the nutrients have been taken out of the soil, and as the wind comes in, it just rips through and encases the whole states at a time in dust. A state in the United States is huge. Like England's about the size of Florida, say. So huge states covered in dust. So there's no food because the soil's no good. People's homes and houses are being destroyed. It's a terrible situation coming at the time when people most need a bit of a break from Mother Nature. So there's a long-term impacts. In the cities, you get something called Hoovervilles. These are named after the president who comes in 1929, a guy called Hoover. He builds or at least his name is put on the Hoover Dam, which is in Nevada, which you might have heard of. It's featured in some of the Grand Theft Auto games. If you've played them, that great big dam to the north of Los Santos is supposedly based on the Hoover Dam. North Los Santos? No, I'm getting the games mixed up. It's in GTA San Andreas. That's not the point. Hoovervilles, these are slums, massive slums. A slum is a temporary neighbourhood where the buildings, as you can see in the photo, basically just panels of wood put together. Awful conditions. No water, no heating, no electricity, no roads, no safety, no police. They are the worst place you could possibly live in a city. And if your house has been taken away from you because you bought it with a mortgage from a bank, a mortgage is just a loan for a house pretty much. So if the bank's loaned you money to buy a house, but they need that money back now, they need to take that mortgage back, then they'll do what's called foreclosing on your house. They'll say, if you can't pay me back the whole of this mortgage money now, then I own this house because I bought it. I bought it through you bought it using my money, therefore technically I bought it, so it's my house, so you can sling your hook. And they kick people out of their houses. This happened quite a lot in 2008 as well, and if you look at cities like Detroit in the United States, this happened a huge amount, and this is why lots of parts of Detroit today are still derelict and still more or less uninhabited because of foreclosures, because of mortgages that were sold to people who couldn't afford them. The 1920s is quite similar. The banks need their money back, so people are kicked out of their house, and the bank takes ownership of the house and then sells it on in order to get money, and the people have nowhere to go. And so the people are homeless, effectively. And so they do what they can. They go and find some planks, they go to uninhabited area of a city, or they go to a place where there already is a Hooverville and they set up these slums. They're called Hoovervilles because they become prevalent under Hoover, who is the president during and after the Great Depression, all the way up until 1933, when he's replaced by Roosevelt. He doesn't set them up on purpose; they just happen under his time, and it's a slum. Slums are as horrible as a place to live as you can imagine. They really are. I mean, if you think about how horrible life was in the First World War, in the trenches, all of the problems there, things like there's no way to get clean because there's no running water and there are no toilets. There's no security for your items. Well, in the First World War there was, because you were all part of the army, and if somebody tried to nick your bacon, then they get court-martialed. In Hooverville, police aren't going to bother. Police don't care. Why would the police come and bother with you? It's a Hooverville. They'd much rather be somewhere else. So crime in these places is enormous. Living conditions are enormous. Because there's no running water, then you get disease like typhus and cholera, which you get from drinking raw sewage. Cholera, massive problem in the Victorian times, because people didn't understand that diseases are caused by carried by bacteria, and so water sources will get mixed up. You draw water out of somewhere, out of a well that had a sewer leaking into it, and that's how you get something like cholera, which is a horrible disease. Tuberculosis as well, very easy to cure today, just take some antibiotics, and don't drink poo water. But in the 1920s, in these Hoovervilles, people don't have a choice. It's water. You've got to drink it. If you don't, you die. And so Hoovervilles are a big problem in the Great Depression. They're only really fixed to an extent by Roosevelt, by not the Great Leap Forward, that's Mao in China in the 1950s. The New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal. So I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. So the Wall Street crash, then, it kind of caps off the end of the 1920s, because the 1920s is, for some, this decade of optimism, this decade of growth, of freedom. If you think about the flappers, if you think about votes for women, life improving for a lot of people. For some in the 1920s, it's a decade where nothing really changes. Think about farmers or coal miners or the working class. Their lives don't really get any better, economically certainly. Culturally, it's a huge boom time. Some of the great fiction of the United States is written in the 1920s. This is roughly the period, it's where The Great Gatsby is set, of course, which if you haven't read, you must go and read it over the Easter holidays. You don't have an excuse either. It's not like you can go anywhere. Read The Great Gatsby, because it's a very accessible novel, and it's one of the great novels by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And it's about the problems behind the 1920s, because it is this huge cultural boom and economic boom, but of course, for many people, it's also a time where life is unbearable at times. And if you think of the lives of black people, it takes a huge amount of courage and grace to stand up to the kinds of atrocities that were committed against black people in the way that the African American community did. For some of you, we had a little look at people like Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois, but for some of you we didn't get a time to. And the reaction in the 1920s of African Americans to the hatred and the violence and the murder and the systemic problems was remarkable for its peacefulness and for its gracefulness in particular. But life for black people in the 1920s, at best it's hard, and at worst it is unbearable. For Native Americans, similarly, there are some good things, but at best it's slightly better than unbearable. And at worst, they're having their culture ripped away from them in these boarding schools and by the government. For whole swathes of the population, the 1920s is a boom time. For whole swathes of the population, it's not. And underlying it all, of course, is prohibition in the era of gangsters, which we'll do some revision on this over the next couple of lessons, because we've still got 2 lessons left of term after this one. but again, that kind of the prohibition, the gangsters, that process, that relationship between the two of them kind of sums up the 1920s. There's a sense of optimism that we can get something like prohibition done in order to improve the country. There's a cultural boom that comes out of speakeasies and music. And there's a horrific underside, which is the violence caused by gangsters over prohibition, which I think almost all of you said in those little essays you did was completely unnecessary and completely infeasible from the beginning. And you can see that all in the Wall Street crash. As long as you've got optimism, Wall Street will keep on going in the 1920s. But as soon as that optimism goes, then so does Wall Street. And that's the story. That's how it happens. That people's optimism goes, the belief in the stock market disappears. And that causes this huge crash that scars the American psyche all the way up until this day. So, that's the lesson. You've got this on the OneNote. I hope that was helpful. If you've got any questions about any of this, then please do ask. I'll put this up on this page tomorrow as I'm recording it. I'm recording this on Thursday evening. Tomorrow we'll have our lesson, but I'll put this up anyway because I know that the video quality there is a bit dodgy, and this will hopefully be more useful as a resource than a recording of me essentially saying to about 46 of you at a time, hello, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? So this is on there. You got the PowerPoint. Any questions, as I said at the beginning, please do ask. This is a difficult time. This is a worrying time, and it's an uncomfortable time. And if I can do anything that will make it easier for you, then please let me know, because it's what I'm here for. Let me know in the chat. Let me know in a message. Let me know via email. Be it about this, be it about anything. Okay. I think that's about it. You've had my email address through all of this. And I will see you next week. Bye now.